On my first mushroom trip, I cleared up most of my issues around childhood sexual abuse, domestic violence.
Many people turn to ayahuasca for traumas of different kinds to help to relieve burdens that have maybe been with them their entire lives and they haven't been able to shake.
It's curious that the one ingredient that is constantly in that recipe of social change, which is consistently expunged from the record, is the fact that tens of millions of us lay prostrate before the gates of awe, having taken some psychedelic.
From the Zoomerplex in historic Liberty Village, the Zoomer with Marissa Lennox.
Welcome to this special presentation of the Zoomer. I'm joined today by our sister station, Joy TV's Natasha Raey.
Thank you so much, Marissa. We recently held an online summit here at ZoomerMedia to delve into the latest research surrounding the use of psychedelics.
On today's show, we'll be looking back at our Psychedelic Summit, where we gathered a group of experts to discuss their experiences with psychedelics and their effort to have them recognized by the broader medical community. But before we dive in, let's tee up the topic.
In 2020, Health Canada allowed terminally ill patients to use psychedelics to treat their anxiety and open a door on a whole new world. New possibilities of legitimate psychedelic therapies are on the horizon as groundbreaking discoveries bring these alternative treatments into the mainstream. From treating PTSD to addiction and everything in between, the growing world of psychedelic healing is poised to radically change the lives of millions of Canadians.
Now, before we take a look at some of the highlights from the Psychedelic Summit, we want to share the story of Lori Brooks.
Lori is one of 4 terminally ill cancer patients who was granted a legal exemption to use psilocybin to treat her end-of-life anxiety. We learn more about her journey from Z News videographer Dean Atwall.
I know my death is probably coming sooner than I like, but I have a lot of living that I want to do still. And so how do I enjoy that? And psilocybin has allowed me to do that.
After being told that she had little over a year left to live due to cancer, Abbotsford resident Lori Brooks turned to psilocybin therapy, specifically magic mushrooms.
I did my first psilocybin trip in October of 2019. The next day I saw my therapist and he asked me how I was feeling. I said, well, I see my cancer in a box beside me on the floor. It's not this black cloud hanging over me anymore. It's on the floor. He said, wow, that would take 10 years of therapy to get somebody to that spot, and you're there in 6 hours.
The use of psychedelic mushrooms became illegal in Canada in 1974. Lori is one of 4 Canadians who have become the first to be exempt from this ruling since then.
Psilocybin is the active agent in what most people would understand to be magic mushrooms. What we like to say, it's a mind manifester. So the communication of the brain under the influence of psychedelic agents break patterns of behavior and thought that have been intractable for years, allowed mood to elevate. There's just wonderful kind of outcomes that come from this done in a certain way.
So they put eye shades so everything is in your head. And then there's a playlist, a lot of heavy classical music that was, and I remember that part of my trip being in these scary places, and that's when I had to deal with all of the really tough stuff. And I felt like I was back on this beach in Maui where these big waves come rolling in and I kept getting knocked over. And I'd just stand up and another one would come and knock me over, and it was just all the grief and pain that I was working through. And eventually they got less and less and less, and I was able to let it all go. And then later on, it was much lighter. There was a few Beatles songs and just happier music near the end. We were at this clearing, and then the lights started coming up, and I went, oh, this is beautiful. And I felt just warm and at peace.
There's people that worry about death all the time, but until you're actually faced with it and have to deal with that emotion and how that affects you, how it's going to affect your children, well, that's a lot of fear and it's a lot of anxiety. But man, after this thing, she just came out of it and went, I'm good, I'll get through it.
It made all the difference for me going through cancer the second time and now facing it a third time. One of the things that I've always said is we have the right to die in Canada, but what about living? I don't want to die yet.
With mounting evidence as to the positive effects of psilocybin, it's clear that many are now researching the medicine of mushrooms. Dean Atwell in Abbotsford.
Thanks, Dean. We want to say a special thank you to Laurie for sharing her story.
Now we're going to hear from Dr. Rami Batal, who is the CEO of Universal Ibogaine. Dr. Batal is a seasoned biopharmaceutical industry executive with an expertise in neuropsychiatry and mental health issues, including substance use disorders.
Universal Ibogaine's mission is quite summarized in its name. So we're talking here about a particular molecule that tends to be quite potent even within the family of psychedelics, Ibogaine. And it is our intent to make that product available as is required legally and medically so that we can deal with the devastating problem of opioid use disorders and other substance use disorders. And we intend to do this globally. We're dealing with complex molecules, broad spectrum in terms of their potency and effect. We aspire, especially when it comes to Ibogaine, which our executive chairman Shane refers to always as the granddaddy of psychedelics. We aspire to have medical supervision in terms of its use, Ibogaine's status as a psychedelic medicine or its origin as something coming out of a plant doesn't give it any free pass in any way. We have many drugs in our arsenal that have come from plants, and they are potent and they are dealt with respect. So we'd expect, at least in the case of Ibogaine, that we will have to look at it as a medical agent under medical supervision. In old tradition of pharmacy, my order, we say the right drug for the right patient at the right time, delivered in the right way. And these are rules that in particular need to be respected for Ibogaine in the context of Universal Ibogaine. As far as access, payment and access and what have you, of course, a big problem in the, or concern in the biopharmaceutical or healthcare industry as a whole. My first foray at this is the following, Natasha. I'd say to our patients, you are dealing with something that wasn't within your control, and it is not something that you should be paying for. Ultimately, our hope is that as we engage the system, the regulatory and legal system, that we will come to a point whereby, similar to other illnesses, these kind of illnesses and that kind of exposure utilizing potent modulators such as the psychedelics that we have, Ibogaine being one, are something that the community and the society has to carry on their behalf. And that's our sort of midterm to long-term objective as we continue to shape the environment. In Universal Ibogaine, I spoke to our medical foray. We do have a sound advocacy and education program that is helping and hoping to shape the environment in a way that we would provide that access certainly to everybody down the road. But in the meantime, so that we can keep you, our dear patients, safe, and we can keep you within the system, we want you to be patient with us. Give us some time. We see some openings in being able to modulate the system to your advantage. Come with us on this journey. Allow us to take you to somewhere where you can be treated cost effectively and in a safe way. Just give us some time on it.
When we come back, we'll hear the experiences of writer, filmmaker, ethnobotanist Wade Davis. Stay tuned.
Our parents used to always say to us when we were kids, don't take these things, you'll never come back the same. And of course, what they didn't understand is that in some sense, was the entire bloody point.
Welcome back to this special edition of The Zoomer. I'm joined by my co-host, Natasha Raey, from our sister station, Joy TV in Vancouver. Today, we're taking a look back at the psychedelic conference recently held by ZoomerMedia to explore this growing new world of medicine.
That's right, Marissa. Gone are the days when the topic of psychedelics was confined to dorm room experimentation and wild parties. In fact, psychedelic drug testing has been steadily making its way back into laboratories. Wade Davis is an ethnobotanist, writer, and filmmaker whose work has taken him around the world. He shares his personal journey with the magic mushroom.
Then we'll hear from Kelsey Ramsden, the co-founder, president, and CEO of Mind Cure Health, a company focused on finding new ways to treat those suffering from mental health crises.
When I think back, to the extent that in my lifetime, women have gone from the kitchen to the boardroom, people of color from the woodshed to the White House, gay people from the closet to the altar, the sea change has been so extraordinary. When I was a kid, just getting people to stop throwing garbage out of a car window was a great environmental victory. No one spoke of the biosphere or biodiversity. Now those terms are part of the vernacular of school children. But when we look back at the catalyst of that sort of extraordinary wave of luminosity, it's curious that the one ingredient that is constantly in that recipe of social change, which is consistently expunged from the record, is the fact that tens of millions of us lay prostrate before the gates of awe, having taken some psychedelic. And I like to say that not only did I take these substances, I wouldn't think the way I think, I wouldn't write the way I write, I wouldn't treat women and people of color and gay people, I wouldn't understand the natural world as I do, had I not had this kind of flash of illumination that is the sheer potency of these substances. I remember our parents used to always say to us when we were kids, don't take these things, you'll never come back the same. And of course, what they didn't understand is that in some sense was the entire bloody point. One of the things that I think we can learn is that we forget that all cultures are myopic, faithful to our own interpretation of reality. And the kind of triumph of secular materialism may be the conceit of modernity, but the ubiquity and power of our way of thinking, the Western modality, if you will, shouldn't suggest it's the norm. And in fact, in our tradition, we kind of de-animated the world under Descartes, and we threw out mysticism, myth, magic, mysticism, and metaphor. And suddenly the world began to be just a sort of the stage set upon which the human drama unfolded. And most societies around the world don't see it that way. They have reciprocity at the essence of who they are. Human beings are responsible for the well-being of the earth, just as the earth owes its bounty to them. And that sense of direct connection to nature, I think is very difficult to achieve if you're raised within the shutters of this worldview of ours. And I think one of the things that psychedelics do is give you that direct access to the wonder of the natural world in a very visceral, deep way. And if you'll just indulge me, I'll tell you a very funny story. Tim Plowman, who I spent a year and a half, 2 years on this extraordinary expedition in pursuit of the divine leaf of immortality. Tim was like an older brother. I was 20, he was 30. I came from logging camps. I was a hunting guide. I had never met a homosexual. I didn't even know what that was in 1974. And Tim, as it turned out, was coming out as a gay man, and he didn't really know it, but he fell in love with me. And that kind of made me feel like all women who, you love me, why don't you sleep with me? You've all heard that one. And but it was getting in our way. It really was getting in our way of our incredible expedition, causing tension and so on. And I didn't know what to do with it. And then we took this heroic dose of MDA. And with another friend of ours, I find ourselves sort of stark naked in the middle of the jungle in Colombia. And I'm looking at Tim's naked body as all the indigenous kids are around looking at the drunk. And I suddenly, focus on his genitalia. Before I know it, I'm putting my hand beneath his limp penis and flipping it up in my hand at the age of 20 and saying, that's all I'm afraid of. That's all I'm afraid of. And that was it. Now, I didn't become homosexual. I didn't start sleeping with Tim. But what I'm trying to say is, that it would have taken years of psychology or theory or Freudian on the couch for me, a kid from logging camps, to understand at that critical moment when most people still didn't know what gay people were in 1974, to have that breakthrough. And I share that, not at the risk of embarrassing myself, but very proudly to say that those kinds of moments of illumination, like a moment of zazen in Zen Buddhism, in allowing all that stuff to fall away, all that pain, I think that really speaks to the clinical potential of these substances.
So MindCure is a life science and technology company transforming how we treat pain, neuroregeneration, and performance. So what we like to think about how we approach things is we create mental wealth. So that's bringing people from despair and dependency into hope and healing through developing novel molecules and AI-driven technology as a back end of that therapeutic journey, really helping therapeutic providers to understand and again the richness and the depth of the research in order to promote and provide safety and efficacy so that these medicines can be adopted and so we can have a cultural shift around psychedelics that I think is really meaningful and for which its time has come. I've always thought of mental wellness kind of on a spectrum or as a speedometer type of situation where you may be in an interventionist moment in your life where a full psychedelic experience is what's warranted for the way that you find yourself. So how do I take a base setting and induce performance or induce a bettering of a current baseline, which is sufficient, but I don't always love sufficient. Sometimes I like better than that. And I see a model where there is a future where both of those things are provided an opportunity within psychedelics to be available to individuals. And that not even withstanding, I think there is this idea that we oftentimes, we take vitamin C or vitamin D or whatever for our neck down mental or our neck down health. And no one really considers this idea of like mental hygiene. What is it I'm doing from the neck up every day to maintain wellness? And so what we're doing at MindCure is I say we're building the medicines for the market and the market for the medicines. So opening people's minds to this idea that you can take adaptogens or nootropics or things that are non-psychedelic but are psychoactive to enhance your mental wellness or your mental wealth. So I'm not so sure that it's an either or for us. And the way that I see it, again, 3 or 5 years down the road is when these treatments and methodologies and medicines become commonplace enough that you say, I went and I had this type of therapy. It doesn't have to be an either or. It can be just what's of service to the individual. And I think also if you've been involved in psychedelic work, there's this mentality of onboarding the individual as a partner in care. There's this idea of that we are informed and consented individuals of sovereign adults who have the ability to make choice about how we choose to hold our mental wellness. And I think that we'll see, through the advancement of psychedelic medicine and the more people who are afforded the opportunity to take part in it, an advancement of how we hold mental wellness entirely.
When we come back, we'll hear more from our panel of experts, as well as a personal story from my co-host, Natasha Raey. That's next.
I was the brother to a drug addict who lost his life to addiction in March of 2019. It demonstrated some of the limitations of the conventional approaches of treating drug addiction.
Welcome back to this special presentation of theZoomer. We're highlighting some of the interesting stories and research looking into the use of psychedelics for medical use. I'm joined today by my co-host, Natasha Raey, from our sister station, Joy TV in Vancouver. And Natasha, I know this is an issue dear to your heart. What can you tell us about your experiences and journey with psychedelics?
Well, for me, I've really seen the benefits that psychedelics have to help people who have been going through depression or trauma, or even just simple things like brain fog and memory loss. And so when I saw the impact that psychedelics had on the people around me, I knew that it was something that I needed to learn a little bit more about and try out for myself. And honestly, the results have been pretty amazing in my own life and in a lot of my loved ones.
Natasha, thank you so much for sharing your experience. We want to go now to Timothy Ko, the CEO of Entheon Biomedical, a company spearheading the development of DMT-assisted therapy. We'll hear how Timothy's personal journey has led him to researching psychedelics to help treat addiction.
We'll also hear from Ronan Levy, an attorney who founded Field Trip Health, a company focused on the development and delivery of psychedelic therapies.
Prior to becoming a psychedelic biotech CEO, I've been a number of things, from leading private ventures, as you mentioned, in the public market space, as well as sort of as a tech founder in the blockchain space. But I think of principal importance, I was the brother to a drug addict who lost his life to addiction in March of 2019. And that was a really informative experience in that it demonstrated some of the limitations of the conventional approaches of treating drug addiction. And over the course of about 20 years, we as a family spent hundreds of thousands of dollars, literally just for any sliver of hope to try to elicit some change. And sadly, all the conventional approaches, and I mean everything from medication-assisted therapy, antidepressants, antipsychotics, anxiolytics, electroconvulsive therapy, all manner of psychotherapies, and the really earnest efforts of hundreds of mental health professionals didn't elicit that change, though they were trying to drive at this sense of stabilization to enable foundationally important introspection to really assess those belief systems that those behaviors are spawned from. None of it had the intended effect. And so we understand that psychedelics have that transformational capacity. But in order to get this into the hands of those people that need it the most, it does need to be validated in a clinical sense and presented to regulators in a form factor where they have no choice but to view things objectively from the perspective of safety and efficacy. And so that's primarily what Entheon does, advancing clinically DMT for the purpose of treating addiction to elicit that really transformational change that's necessary to change addiction behaviors, not just treating the symptoms of addiction and not proposing a sort of once daily type model, but really taking a holistic, comprehensive approach to care and establishing that context and intent over time within a therapeutic framework to really drive a transformation and create like a lifetime change. And so that's what we're focused on, but we're also investing heavily into the genetics and the brain imaging space to give further nuance and understanding to what constitutes a psychedelic experience so that physicians can be armed with the sort of intelligence that they need to make the appropriate types of prescriptive decisions, as well as to personalize healthcare in such a way that maximizes the potential of these psychedelic related experiences.
So there's two primary focuses within Field Trip right now. First is Field Trip Health, which is building out the clinical infrastructure for the delivery of psychedelic therapies. What makes psychedelics so exciting? There are many things that make psychedelics so exciting, but one of the things that I find so exciting about it is that it really requires a new approach to medicine. When it comes to psychedelics, you'll hear people talk about set and setting, which means the actual location where you have a psychedelic therapeutic experience matters. And so typical clinics, typical doctor's offices aren't well suited for this kind of care. So with Field Trip Health, we're building out a whole new clinical infrastructure that's really designed to make a warm, welcoming, safe place for these kind of therapies to be administered. On the other side of the equation within Field Trip, we have Field Trip Discovery, which is working on advancing the science and research around psychedelics. And so we're doing two things primarily within Field Trip Discovery. First is advancing development of a novel psychedelic molecule called FT104, which is designed to be almost like psilocybin in its effect and therapeutic potential, but with a much shorter time frame, a much shorter duration of experience to make it more accessible. Because one of the biggest challenges with psychedelic therapies is just how time intensive and expensive it is because of that time intensity. So by shortening the experience time and making it easier for more people to participate, we expect to be able to deliver greater access. And we're also doing work with the actual psilocybin producing mushrooms themselves. There's a lot of interest and excitement, very similar to cannabis, about the mushrooms as opposed to just psilocybin, which is the active ingredient we talk about. So that's the scope of what we're doing at Field Trip right now.
We'll have more from our Psychedelic Summit on this special edition of the Zoomer coming up.
The whole idea is that a soul, your soul, goes on a journey.
Welcome back. I'm joined by my co-host Natasha Raey in Vancouver for this special edition of the Zoomer, highlighting some of the presentations during our Psychedelic Summit.
I've told you a bit about my journey, but each individual is unique, something that Chris Killam knows all too well. He is a global medicine hunter, explorer, and psychedelic advocate who the New York Times has called part David Attenborough, part Indiana Jones. Here is Chris Killam.
As you mentioned, I do travel around the world. I investigate medicinal plants of all different types, non-psychoactive, psychoactive herbs and spices, and I help to establish sustainable chains of trade around the world. And no place have I spent as much time as I have in the Amazon rainforest. I've been fortunate to go there about 35 times to investigate more than 15 rivers or so. And from a personal reward standpoint, I've had the unique opportunity to travel with, live with, work with, and engage in ceremonial practices with a great many shamans throughout Brazil and in Ecuador and also in Peru. And so I want to talk a little bit about ayahuasca today. And I also want to talk a bit about keeping the psychedelics wild. In 1967, which seems like a good place to start because that's when I very first ever swallowed 250 micrograms of LSD and had my very first experience with psychedelics. Jimi Hendrix, the guitarist, came out with an album called Are You Experienced? And the thing that was beautiful about that album was everybody understood the question if they were experienced. At that time, there was a lot of LSD going around. People also had some access to peyote. But for most of us, we turned to other things. And it was this experience that informed us and in many ways set a number of us on a different kind of social path and philosophical path than really what was going on with the times coming out of the gray 1950s. And in my time in the Amazon, I've been extremely fortunate to sit in ceremony, in ayahuasca ceremonies with many shamans, some of them Shipibo, some of them Mestizo, different people from different backgrounds. And ayahuasca is utterly unique among all of the psychedelics because it is combinatory. Either plant, either the vine or the leaf, without the other, without this utterly ingenious indigenous pharmacology that somehow put together this spectacular beverage that takes you on a spiritual journey. Without one of the plants, it doesn't work. So it is quite remarkable that we have this assembly of these two plants amidst 80,000 or so. The thing about ayahuasca is that it is, when it is used in a ceremonial setting, at least among many traditions, and certainly not all traditions who utilize ayahuasca, there is a beginning and a middle and an end to it. You engage in this for the purpose of learning something, for the purpose of healing something, maybe for the purpose of gaining insight. In earlier tribal days, perhaps people got together and tried to figure out why somebody was having trouble hunting. It's very different now. Many people turn to ayahuasca for traumas of different kinds, to help to relieve burdens that have maybe been with them their entire lives and they haven't been able to shake. And this is the thing about ayahuasca and about the psychedelics in general as healing agents that I think makes them so dynamic. At their best, they are utterly thorough. They are completely immersive. They leave nothing behind. I do understand and appreciate that today we have many people exploring and utilizing psychedelics from a microdosing standpoint, sub-therapeutic or sub-tripping doses, if you will, to sparkle the mind, to spark the imagination, to fuel creativity, to boost overall energy. And that is a very good and very valuable use, but it is not the trip. Ayahuasca, in the best of circumstances, takes you on a powerful and radical journey into a visionary landscape that is part your imagination, part things that are brought in by the songs that the shamans sing, the ikaros, the healing songs that draw in plant spirits into the ceremonial space to assist in healing. The whole idea is that a soul, your soul, goes on a journey.
More from our Psychedelic Summit when we come back. Stay tuned.
For me, it's an exciting time in mushrooms. I'm already crazy about mushrooms.
Welcome back to this special edition of theZoomer. Today I'm joined by Natasha Raey of Joy TV, who recently co-hosted a summit on psychedelics and medical research making strides.
During our summit, we gathered a panel of scientists, explorers, and visionaries in the field of psychedelics to share their experiences and expertise. Next, we have New York Times best-selling author Brian Murarescu. He spent 12 years investigating the influence of psychedelics on religion.
Then we'll hear from Terry Smith, the CEO of Wake Jamaica Limited, about her history and work with magic mushrooms.
I'm a psychedelic virgin. I've never experimented with psychedelics, and I spent 12 years researching and writing this book, really looking for the objective scientific data in my effort to kind of resurrect some of these ritualistic practices that were at the roots of Western civilization. The sacred pharmacology that largely went missing over the course of the past 2,000 years. And so in my own case, I'm kind of, just putting these pieces together to figure out what this would look like today for me. What kind of ritual, when we look back to ancient Greece or to Paleo-Christianity, would make sense today. So I guess I'm still waiting for those pieces to come together.
Now, Brian, you spent 12 years investigating what the most influential religious scholars of the 20th century called the best kept secret in history, psychedelics. And why did they keep this secret?
I'm still trying to answer that question. That was Houston Smith who said that a few decades ago. And I think he was referring to the rites at Eleusis, for example, which was kind of like the spiritual capital of the ancient world. It called to the best and brightest of Athens and Rome for, we think, close to 2,000 years. I.e., as long as Christianity itself has been around. Whatever happened there was some kind of visionary event. So we can't prove definitively that it was a psychedelic facilitated event, but I went on the hunt for that data to try and prove it one way or the other. And I think part of this is kept secret for lots of reasons that Wade is very familiar with. These things are very dangerous and very potent. And I think maybe some of the concern in the ancient world was to restrict the handling of these compounds to those who had the technical expertise to do so, like you might find around the world today with shamans, for example. I think there were technicians in the antiquity of Western civilization as well. And maybe that's part of the reason behind the secrecy, because these things can be very dangerous, but also very revelatory in the right set and setting.
So how about you, Terry? What's your personal story?
My first experience was 2019. I had a girlfriend who kept talking about magic mushroom. And since I was known across the Jamaican landscape as the mushroom lady, a lot of people kept coming to me to ask about the mushroom. And I was going through a lot of my own stuff. So I decided, along with my girlfriend Sharon, that we would do our first trip. A lot of things that I had spent dozens of years in Toronto going to a psychiatrist about was still on the back shelf for me. And on my first mushroom trip, I cleared up most of my issues around childhood sexual abuse, domestic violence, abandonment of parent, and all of those issues. So very quickly, I became a very big supporter of the medicine of mushrooms. For me, it's an exciting time in mushrooms. I'm already crazy about mushrooms because there is a type of mushroom for everything. There is your mushroom for treating your cancer, for improving mental health. But for me, in Jamaica at the moment, what Wake is doing and what mushroom offers is an opportunity to make access to mental health more democratic. We have a culture here where there is a separation between your physical, your spiritual, and your mental health. So people who actually turn to mental health professionals in this culture are looked down upon. It's something that you can't wipe away. So what mushroom has been doing for us is to open that conversation again about taking care of yourself mentally and spiritually. And the crossover that psychedelic mushrooms afford you is that my own experience and the experience of my friends, and it didn't matter what social economic level the people that I talk to are from, when they consume mushrooms, they see that coming together of and it's prescriptive. We don't talk about it a lot in that mushroom. When you consume mushroom, you can speak a language of shared experiences. We all enter the waiting room. We after having consumed the mushroom, we all end up the next day or going forward into your life with enough space. Instead of reacting always to things, mushroom affords you that small mental, physical, and spiritual space instead of reacting to things right away. And that's been the experience that I've been having here in Jamaica, in that regardless of who I've sat down and interacted with, who have consumed psychedelic mushrooms, we all share that thing of having had an opportunity to turn around and look back to ourselves, and bring together the spiritual and the mental into our physical self.
When we come back, final thoughts from our panelists. That's next. Welcome back to the Zoomer. Once again, I'm joined by my co-host, Natasha Raey in Vancouver.
Thank you so much, Marissa. It was a joy to host our recent Psychedelic Summit and now be able to highlight some of our fascinating speakers on this special episode of the Zoomer.
As is customary, we're going to look back at some of our panelists' final thoughts. Take a look.
I don't think that we should be looking at these substances entering the informational space and being in everybody's top of the tongue and top of the mind. I don't think that it is a panacea, and I don't think that anything is. And if I could say one thing to wrap it all up, I don't want to ever equate natural with safe and effective. I don't want us to think that anything that we can encounter in nature is okay for us to consume and free of long-term consequences. So just because the nature produces it does not mean that we will benefit from consuming it in whatever form. So whatever direction the development of psychedelic medicine takes, I hope that these substances are decriminalized and nobody's going to jail for using them for their own benefit. And secondly, when we develop them for the medicinal use, that we use them in a cautious manner, and we train our medical health professionals to know what these substances are, to know how they work, and to know how they can best help their patients with the use of these substances.
Wade.
Well, I think we shouldn't be naive about these substances. You know, they are inherently subversive. The government came down very heavily when they were first brought to the attention of the West in the 1960s. They can come down heavily again. We shouldn't be naive about the war on drugs. The United States is spending upwards of $60 billion some years on the war on drugs. Every part of the government has a piece of that pie. The one thing I've discovered over the years is that there's essentially no difference between the men and women of the cartels that I've encountered in Medellin, Colombia, and the DEA agents that I've met in Washington, D.C. They're both sides of the same coin. Neither side has any interest in whatsoever in the war on drugs ending or in anybody winning the war on drugs, because one side would be out of its budget, the other side would be out of its profits. And so we shouldn't underestimate the power and the strength of those who will oppose efforts to create more sane policies, not just about psychedelics, but about all drugs that are now illicit.
Terry?
And I live in a country where psychiatry is not democratic to most of the people who need it. And I see the availability of psychedelic, having experienced it, as an important window for hope. And I see the clinical research and the things that Wake is doing and the commitment of the young man who leads my company, Nick Murray, as giving me hope for a future. Instead of me taking Wellbutrin or something that has incredible side effects, I'd have 2 or 3 trips and my world changed. And so I know it's not a panacea, and I know that it's not for everyone, but if half of the people who do it can get the relief that I did, and minus the stigma of being mentally ill, then I'll take that. And so what we do at Wake and what I hope for psychedelics is that we make it more democratic, that poor people and people of color can get the help they need.
Thank you. And finally, Brian.
I would only say that this is a long story. We talked about storytelling at the very beginning. I think psychedelics are a very long story. In my book, very artificially begins 12,000 years ago at the end of the last ice age. I would say that our relationship with these plants and fungi is a process of co-evolution that goes back millions of years. And we were born into a very strange time on the planet when these compounds, these natural compounds, have been demonized. I think that's changing. And I think the next 10 years are going to prove to be some of the most transformational of recent memory because of this, and because of not just the scientific and medical value, but I'd say the spiritual value of these compounds, and reintroducing perhaps the concept of ritual, rites of passage to Western civilization. This is, when I go back in history, that's what I find. And that's my hope for the future, is that we can sacralize our relationship with these very powerful allies.
Thank you for being with us, and thank you to my co-host Natasha Raey in Vancouver. I'll see you soon. For now, it's time to zoom out.